Now with this, we will have to move to our first panel. So we are asking the panelists, the panel chair, we have already Daniel VEKONY from Corvinus University, and the four panelists. So please, the four panelists join the meeting. Your cameras should be turned on, and then we can see you, all the four panelists, please. And then once we have it, yes, it seems to be we have 1, 2, 3 so far. Who is missing? And now we have 4. Oh, no. Do we have 4? I mean, we have 4 speakers, at least. Let me see. Hasan, and who is missing?
I think we have everybody on board, Csaba.
Yes, 1. Oh, no, I didn't see 4, but now I have another person. Okay, so from my perspective, it's okay, but you are the chair, you are the boss, and now I just pass over the direction of this panel right now. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming, and I give the floor to the panel chair, VEKONY, Daniel VEKONY.
Thank you so much, Csaba. So welcome everybody to this first panel of the Cold War History Research Center's. This is the 11th annual conference. I cannot believe it. So this panel is going to be on the Middle East and Africa in the Cold War. We've got Hasan GONDER from the University of Szeged. We have Faruh KUZIEV from the CEU in Vienna. We have Tibor PINTER from the University of Szeged as well. And we have Buyisile NTAKA from the Corvinus University of Budapest. As usual, you are going to have 20 minutes. And since we are a little bit behind schedule, I would like to ask you to keep to this 20 minutes, but nevertheless, I'm going to indicate if you may be running out of time, I'm just gonna bomb you with private messages. Okay, so and this is going to be our schedule, and I would like to ask Hasan GONDER to come forward first with his presentation on the negative effects of Cold War era on Turkey, the end of village institutes and reform studies.
Yes, can everyone see the PPT?
Yes, I can.
Great. Before I forget, first of all, I would like to thank for the opportunity to give a presentation in this amazing conference. Hello everyone, I am Hasan GONDER. I am PhD student at the University of Szeged in History Department. My research interest is Turkish modernization and professionalization in rural areas of Turkey. And today I'm going to give you a presentation about negative effects of Cold War era on Turkey, the end of village institutes and reform studies. The Republic of Turkey was proclaimed in 1923. Since then, the reform and modernization has started in the country. However, in 1945, Soviet Union refused to renew the Turkish-Soviet Friendship and Non-Aggression Agreement in March 1945. Thereupon, had several demands from Turkey in which Turkey cannot accept. This situation put Turkey on the brink of war with Soviet Union. The reality of not being strong enough to fight against the Soviet Union pushed Turkey to seek alliance with the other pole, and Turkey had to transit to the multi-party system imposed by the United States and Western states in order to enter. Such changes, which seem as a positive outcome, in theory, has profoundly affected Turkey negatively. In this study, the documents in personal archive of İsmail Hakkı Tonguç, one of those who made the greatest effort to modernize rural areas in the country and open to the public in the last few years, were used. These documents gave a better insight to Mr. Tonguç's achievement of modernization in the rural areas of the country, the way he overcame the difficulties he faced, and his design of this initiative. Also, document analysis method was used in this study. Here is the socio-political situation of the country in 1930s and 1940s. Turkey did not want any interruption with their reform studies, and also since they already experienced the cost of the war, they did everything to remain impartial in the World War II. However, even though Turkey was impartial, the country economically affected in this war. In 1938, the founder of the country, Atatürk, has passed away, and this situation has changed the Soviet Union's perspective towards Turkey. Stalin believed that without Atatürk, the country will be in chaos. However, Turkey's second man, İnönü, managed to keep the country together and continued the reform studies. Even they have started the rural modernization in 1935. And with village institutes, the rural transformation was accelerated. The Village Institutes project is a program that was ahead of its time by aiming to improve the conditions of the villages and raise the level of education. Hence, reformists have planned village institutes as a tool to bring revolution and reforms to villages. Village Institutes is an initiative constructed on village reality. 20 institutes, each of which could accommodate 1,000 boarding students, were established throughout the country. In 1945, 16,400 teacher candidates were recruited in these institutes. They have both raised teachers, educators, health officers, and professionals for other professions. At the beginning of 1946 academic year, 5,542 teachers, 8,755 educators, and 521 health officers had been trained within the village institutes. The total graduates of teachers and educators of the institutes was around 15,000 just at the beginning of the 1946. After 108 years of work, only 6,785 teachers could be provided to the villages. With these outputs, we can see the success of the institutes. Here are the demands of Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, as I mentioned earlier, did not resign the Turkish-Soviet Friendship and Non-Aggression Agreement in 1945, and giving a note to Turkey, has staked claim over the straits and demanded the cities of Kars and Ardahan, located within the Turkish borders, belong to the claim that those areas are belong to the Armenians in the communist bloc, and that these cities shall be returned to them. Here, as you can see in the picture, two lines are drawn inside the borders of Turkey. Soviet Union requested the lands in the first line. However, if Turkey agreed to give, their plan was to demand the lands in the second line, in which painted in pink. Of course, this situation scared Turkey, and Turkey started to seek for alliance, in which the only alternative was the Western Bloc. However, Western Bloc was not too eager to include Turkey in their bloc due to their political system, which was one party. As a precondition, they demanded Turkey to democratize their country politically and transition to multi-party system. Also, Turkey had to attend the Korean War in order to consolidate their position in the Western Bloc, and 741 Turkish soldiers died in the Korean Peninsula. Turkey has transitioned to multi-party system in 1946, and with the election held in the same year, Democrat Party got enough votes to enter the parliament and became the opposition party. It's important to mention that this transition to multi-party system was not voluntary, because the leading reformists in the country knew that Turkish people were not ready for such a dramatic change. Also, Democratic Party gathered all anti-reform traditionalists and landlords under their umbrella. These people supported Democrat Party not to democratize the country more, but for the opposite reason. Here you can see the leader of the Democrat Party, Adnan Menderes, who was also the prime minister between 1950 to 1960. Within 1960 military coup, he got death penalty punishment, unfortunately. Here you can see the cause-effect relationship. I know it looks odd. If I were you, probably I would think the same, why such a democratic change would have a bad effect. It's supposed to accelerate the modernization. However, I will explain in more detail the reason why I think in this way. Is the transition to multi-party system a positive outcome for Turkey or not? In theory, yes. In practice, no, because Turkish society was not ready for such a dramatic change. In order to show the point of my view, I would like to give an example of two attempts to transition to multi-party system in 1924 and in 1930. During Atatürk period, the founder of the country, he tried twice. However, both of the attempts were unsuccessful because people who against the secular republican regime gathered under another party and attempted to riot. Here is the propaganda of the Democrat Party, you can see. The second guy is another founder of the Democrat Party. He is also the closest friend of Atatürk. After the coup, he didn't get the death penalty punishment because of his older age. So the thing I want to emphasize here that he also got the death penalty punishment, even though he was the closest friends of the founder and one of the leading figure in the national struggle. Only his old age saved him from such a bad end. In the second attempt to transit the multi-party system, Atatürk made his closest friend Fethi Okyar, as you can see in the picture, the guy who is giving speech, to establish Free Republican Party and make this change. In his first rally in Izmir, thousands of people attended and started to shoot against Atatürk reforms and Republican regime. After that, the Menemen incidents, in which occurred in the same year, scared Turkish intellectuals. In this incident, a group of people who wants Sharia started to riot and killed the soldiers who came to support this riot. Here I want to show a tiny detail in the picture. As you can see, Fethi Okyar put the picture of Atatürk in order to show that he's also supporting the Republican regime reforms, and he's in the same line with the Atatürk. But however, the result didn't change. And Fethi Okyar, after this rally and the Menemen incident, by his own will, he decided to close to the party. Why Turkish society was not ready? I mean, Turkey started their modernization and reforms with the proclamation of the Republic in 1923. However, these modernization studies only started in the cities. In rural areas where the 80% of the population resided could not benefit from the Republican regime, reforms, or any other social services. They were only in the giving side. They were giving these taxes to the Republican regime, and they were giving to the soldiers, as it was in the Ottoman Empire. In return, they received nothing. Rural areas were abandoned at the mercy of the rural notables, namely landlords. At one side, there were people living in the cities who enjoyed the Republican regime and every opportunities offered by this regime. In the other side, there were rural people which represent the majority of the population and receive nothing in return. And the interesting fact is that most of the people living in the rural side did not even know that Turkey has transited to the Republic from the empire. And they think that they are still in the empire with the Sultan, you know, like in the Ottoman Empire. Why the new regime has abandoned the rural areas? Because the country just make transition from empire to the republic, and change is a process, of course, and especially in rural areas, old order continued. Secondly, insufficient infrastructure and economic difficulties. The country was established after two wars, the First World War and the national struggle, and economic situation of the country was terrible. Also, the World War II conditions economically affected the country as well, even though they were impartial. The other two factors are the dispersed structure of rural areas and rural notables, in which I'm going to explain in more details. Here in this table, as you can see, the comparison of villages and cities with each other and within themselves are given. As you can see from the table, 80% of the population resides in rural area, and more importantly, half of the population resides in villages where the population less than 400. Having 40,000 villages with different populations and needs in rural areas is the biggest obstacle in the way of modernization of rural areas. I also detected a variety of differences between the villages. It's even possible to mention the existence of two types of villages in Turkey's rural areas. First one could be the villages with more than 400 inhabitants, which were generally located by busy roads and close to the markets and towns. And second one could be the villages with a population of less than 400, far from busy roads and markets. The fact that villages with a population of less than 400 were far away from each other, and the separation from each other in terms of economic and social life further complicated the existing situation. Here you can also see the number of children in school age, how many of them attending the school, how many of them not attending the school. Also the need of teachers and educators for each type of the village. For the villages, the population less than 400, I have calculated the need of the teacher and educator. Which was I have detected that 27,000 of the teachers are needed in these villages. Of course, several factors were affected in this calculation. First, the distance between villages. Second, the mean of transportation due to insufficient infrastructure and not using their animals as means of transportation. Some doesn't even have animals, and they have replaced animals in order to cultivate their land. And the third one is the means of the transportation were on foot between the villages, and it takes hours to arrive from one village to another. And rural notables, another obstacle was rural notables, in other words, landlords and imams. These people have expanded their authority by taking advantage of the lack of authority in rural areas. This situation started during the Ottoman Empire, and the villagers had to seek from the help from the Aga Bey and landlords in order to be able to do their work in all matters. Since they were only on the giving side, giving soldiers and taxes in their relationship with the empire and later with the Republican regime, as such, the rural notables stood against and prevented the spread of initiative in rural areas when any enterprise in rural areas was incompatible with their interest. For this reason, Village Institute's initiative, which aimed to modernize rural areas and eliminate the authority of the rural areas, was attacked by them. And these people put pressure on the regime to end this initiative with various propagandas. On the picture, of course, the guy is not a real rural notables. He is a famous actor. However, in most of the movies, he acted as the rural notable. That's why I put this picture in order to give you an idea how the rural notables look like. Here is the relations between the rural notables and the new regime. Between 1920 to 1935, the regime did not need the support of the people. For this reason, they have changed their focus group to the landlords. Even though both classes have supported the national movement, the regime used village notables as a mediator between the regime and the peasantry, and the new regime has reached the rural areas throughout the rural notables. Between 1935 to 1940, there was an undeclared war. The regime realized that the situation in rural areas had to be changed with the events occurred in 1930, as I mentioned earlier, so that the regime decided to reach the rural areas by itself. In 1935, the founder of the country, Atatürk, set up a commission to search rural areas, and at the end of this research, village educators experiment emerged. With the positive results of this project, this initiative was developed further and Village Institute initiative emerged. Between 1942 and 1946, the villages started to develop when the teachers and educators of the Village Institute started giving education in villages. This development is of course bilateral, while the physical environment of the villages was being developed. Also, the villages went through an intellectual enlightenment. The villagers have begun to learn about the Republican regime, the rights they possess with this regime. Of course, this situation has disturbed the rural notables because there is now a new authority in rural areas, and this new authority wants to eliminate the old order. In 1946, with the transition to multi-party system, landlords and traditionalists gathered under Democrat Party and with various propagandas undermined village institutes. Reformists were not only defeated in the parliament, but also in the party itself, in the People's Republican Party. Conservatives in the People's Republican Party defeated the reformists inside the party and took power in 1946. And of course, this has ended the village institutes and the reform studies in the country. Failing of the spreading of revolution all around the country and the fear that the country will be occupied by the Soviet Union has deeply affected people. Everyone started to fear of communism, and with the transition to multi-party system, a sharp opposition came into existence with the Democrat Party entering the parliament as an opposition party and the unification of anti-reform traditionalists and landlords using the fear of communism at that time. This sharp opposition claimed that the people raised in the institutes were communist, with the mentality of to throw enough mud and some will stick. Of course, this situation led to the formation of prejudice against the institutes in the society, and this initiative was terminated in 1946 when the reformists within the People's Republic Party lost their power. In other way, Soviet Union's demands led to the closure of the Turkish village institutes, and that it caused the suspension of the reform studies that started in 1923. Thank you very much for all listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for this.
I'm trying to close the PPT. Yes. I think I closed it. Great.
Thank
Hi, Daniel, we could not hear you. You are muted.
I am experiencing some IT issues now. You can hear me. So thank you so much, Hasan, again for this very interesting presentation. And let us move on to our next presenter in line, Faruh KUZIEV, who is going to speak about Muslim scientists, Muslim soldiers, and Muslims.
Hi.
So Faruh, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you all see my slides right now? Can you confirm and you can see and hear me well?
Yes.
And you can see the slide? Thank you.
Yes.
All right. Thank you for the invitation and for having me at the conference. Just a couple of corrections. I still live in Budapest, even though the university left, and I'm kind of enrolled in the Hungarian program. So I represent here also Hungarian academia in a way. And to kind of push off and locate myself in the scholarship on the Cold War, and it's something that Professor Kramer couldn't address for the lack of time, is that I concentrate on the peaceful dimension of the Cold War, indicated and probably discovered and fashioned by such scholars as David Engerman, Marsha Kerasirova, and Artemy Kalinovsky, the student of Westats. So I don't really concentrate on the Cold War as a war of containment, but as a world systemic competition between capitalism and socialism, which had particular effects on ideology, identity, and culture, which was also outlined by Professor Kramer, and resulted in a particular variant of late socialism within the Soviet Union in Central Asia as a case study. So the way I got interested in the Cold War really was by rediscovering my own past and my home little town called Sharora, that you can see on the first slide, and the unusual landscape that it strikes with the visitors. So it has apartment buildings, some kind of elements of religious worship, also scientific institutions such as Space Observatory and an agricultural research institute. And it's all in the Tajik countryside in the middle of villages and kolkhozes. So that gave me an idea that this particular place has something to do with the Cold War and with the competition between the superpowers. So I decided to conduct a microhistory of that place and see what kind of relation it has to the Cold War. So what was happening for me in the Cold War, like the things in the Cold War that I concentrate on was, first of all, the decolonization. And to reflect on the question that was posed and when exactly the Cold War started, I think the post-World War II period is specifically interesting. And is there something special about this period is because during Stalin, the main doctrine of the Soviet Union was socialism in one country. Expansion was not a priority, but the internal improvement of the socialist regime was a priority. While under Khrushchev, the Soviet Union became a little more adventurist and a little more expansionist, and we can talk of the things such as red globalization. So that is why the post-World War II period is particularly meaningful for me. And it was also the time when the nation state was the principal actor in the international politics, and the preference was given to international diplomacy rather than the military action. Of course, there was still violence, and you have heard the lecture yourselves, but still the main field where the states interacted was international diplomacy. And this resulted in an increasing autonomy of different actors in the world politics, even within the USSR. And that's one of my claims, is that within the Soviet Union, individual republics had more authority and more autonomy in conducting their internal domestic politics, but also international politics. It's an interesting fact that Tajik SSR, the country that I'm talking about today, had its own MFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, since 1944. Yeah, and it wasn't a low-key institution. One of the Secretary Generals of the Tajik Communist Party, Jabar Rasulov, came from that very institution. That's why individual republics within Central Asia under the Soviet rule exhibited a great amount of international ambitions. And that was not conflicting with the broader agenda of the Soviet Union at the time. Khrushchev famously said, addressing the head of the Communist Party of Tajikistan, Babajan Gafurov, that you are Muslims. He referred to Tajik communists saying, you guys are Muslims, so you're better positioned in dealing with the third world, and convince them that socialism is a good idea in general and that socialist modernity is the way to go. So I'm also interested in the Cold War as a religious phenomenon. Do you see the slides changing? Yeah. And I have a chapter in my dissertation titled The Cold War as a Christian Jihad, because the religious dimension of the Cold War started almost immediately with the beginning of the Cold War itself. Harry Truman in 1946, addressing the domestic audience in several conferences, was defining the US as a God-fearing democracy and the nature of the conflict as opposing the godless and despotic communism. And in general, he was calling for a moral and spiritual awakening. So you can see that from the very beginning, religion was instrumentalized to justify the antagonism between the superpowers, and also gave a sense of identity to the American people. Maybe for the first time, Americans felt like one community. But the religious dimension of the Cold War had also unexpected results in Central Asia, of which I will talk a little later. One important implication for Central Asia during the Cold War is that the region took its present-day form. The main features of these of Central Asian capitals was that they became more urban, more industrialized, and more international societies. And on these pictures, you see Tashkent, which underwent the process of kind of creative destruction, as we call this process in academia these days, that the city was built anew to showcase to the third world that the transformative power of the Soviet modernity. And immediately after this large-scale reconstruction of the Central Asian cities, they were visited by the Third World delegations, and Tashkent hosted a film festival in 1968. It was a major advancement. But what is interesting is that the Central Asian communist elites were using the language of decolonization and the discourses available to them at the time to lobby greater investment of attention and material resources for the development of the region. But from the point of view of the capital cities, this looks very nice and neat, but what about the countryside? And this is maybe some kind of a response to Önder. The things were happening in the countryside in the communist Central Asia, to me, were very enigmatic and also very thought-provoking. And the hypothesis of my dissertation and today's presentation is that the way the Cold War materialized in Central Asia were the three generations of Soviet Muslims. And I call them Muslim scientists, Muslim soldiers, and Muslims. So who were the Muslim scientists? First of all, the designation Muslim scientist was also a Cold War designation. So as I said earlier, Khrushchev would refer to Central Asians exclusively as Muslims. And since the advent of the Soviet rule in the region, there was a concentration of intellectuals in Tajikistan, and that fact enticed many rural youth into doing science. These Muslim scientists were to show the Third World that Muslim and Soviet ways of life were compatible. The designation Muslim scientist figured in the political language of Khrushchevian era and has been taken up by the Western academia, by the way. Masha Kirasirova's work is very illuminating in this sense. But what bothered me personally was how really Muslim were these people. So on the one hand, they were communists. On the other hand, they were scientists. And I personally wondered, how much Muslim can you remain? When I conducted my microhistorical research, I was excavating a lot of evidence that there was a consistent and persistent expression of religiosity, specifically of Islamic beliefs, in their memoirs, in letters, and in interviews. So even in places where there was where you did not expect to see something to do with the religion, such as this local history sketch, there was a reference to Quran to explain the phenomenon of earthquakes, and also the book was decorated by an Islamic insignia. So that was already a striking fact. But also, just recently I found out that Babajan Gafurov, whom I mentioned, by the way, you can see him on this left side image, among other Muslim scientists, that he went to Mecca in 1974 before he died in 1977. So it was he committed a Hajj pilgrimage, and he was carried around all the sacred places. And when he returned to Dushanbe, he said something, and it's an anecdote right now, but I'm trying to verify it, that I was the head of the Communist Party of Tajikistan, but it's really nothing. I was the academician, the head of the Academy of Sciences of Tajik Republic, but it also is nothing. Now I'm a Haji, I will come back to my village and people will appreciate it even more. So to him, like becoming a Haji at the very end of his life was a meaningful thing. So the second generation of Muslims, people whom I call Muslim soldiers, they started figuring in American intelligence and American military reports. The famous RAND Corporation has problematized this demographics very extensively in one of their reports that I found. It was inside the Soviet Army in Afghanistan. So this generation has something to do with the militarization of the Cold War in the 1970s. As a result, people from this village or town, Sharora, were enmeshed in the militarization of the Cold War by serving in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and most notably in Afghanistan as fighters of the famous Muslim Battalion and beyond. So Muslim Battalion was a specific group of soldiers within the Soviet Army fighting in Afghanistan. Throughout and after the war in Afghanistan, they have remained Muslim, just as the Mujahideens they were facing. So in this quote from the RAND Corporation, you can see that there's a sense that Soviet Muslims were the weakest link in the architecture of the state of the Soviet state. And there were real expectations that the major problems with the Soviet regime will begin in its Central Asian periphery, and that the war in Afghanistan was the ultimate test to the loyalty of Central Asian Muslims to the Soviet state. So I can give you like 5 quotes from the same document where this is stated. But when I went to the field, I was talking to local residents, and I realized that these people were socializing in the cult of the war. There was a particular cultural phenomenon of the Brezhnev era. You will see the commemoration practices multiplied in Central Asia and across the Soviet state in general. And I saw a lot of images of people taking pride in their participation in various Cold War episodes. The image to the left is a veteran of the Hungarian uprising suppression. So he's a Soviet soldier who went to Budapest to suppress the revolution there. But this fact, along with the Prague events, was still celebrated in Tajikistan when I went for my field research. But a more interesting and striking image is this person to the right. When I first saw the picture, I thought that this is a picture of a mujahideen, because this guy looks really like an Islamist insurgent. But when I picked up the documents, I realized that it's a Soviet soldier in Afghanistan. So he's a veteran, and all of these medals were received for killing and fighting his fellow Muslims in Afghanistan. So the reality was quite the opposite. Because of this Cold War as a biopolitical phenomenon in Central Asia or anywhere in Soviet Union, and also as this cultural phenomenon, there was really no problem with going and participating in the Soviet action in Afghanistan. So in a way, many expectations and anxieties of the time were disproved. And after so many years, this Afghan war ended up nationalized by the community that I was researching, and every year they commemorate their participation in the war in the local high school. And among these people, there's one Hoji today, and several mullahs and ishans, and for them there is absolutely no problem to celebrate both participation in the war in Afghanistan and also professing religion. And finally, people I call Muslims. So if the scientists were Muslims and the soldiers were Muslims, how do we call people who actually believed in God and did something with the religion professionally? So I call them Muslims. We can come up with a better term if you have good ideas about that. And how did they come to exist? So the Soviet-Afghan War and other episodes of the Cold War had a profound impact on the Soviet image among Muslim intellectuals outside and inside the USSR. Tajik intelligentsia, who were employed by the Soviet state for anti-imperialist diplomacy, had gradually developed their own anti-colonial discourses, this time directed against the Soviet state that nurtured them. The day when local and Republican Muslim leaders in Sharora presented themselves as a visible community was January 23, 1989, when the famous Gisar earthquake slid a landmass and rolled it down to the southern edges of Sharora, burying 289 people underneath. This natural disaster was quickly narrativized as a national tragedy, and the local conspiracy theory claimed that the earthquake was caused by an accidental missile launch by a drunk soldier on duty in a secret missile base. So this 1989 earthquake really magnetized the public imagination, and maybe it was one of the first anti-colonial situations within the USSR. But it wasn't only Muslim, the Islam or religion in general, that organized the everyday life in this community. Increased mobility and international travel by scientists and soldiers resulted in ambiguities of everyday life. Hundreds of people were traveling to and from Tajikistan to Europe, Middle East, Asia, and they were bringing books, records, music records, and also they were bringing cultural lifestyles and other products. And as a result, Sharora was becoming this very complex linguistic, ethnic, and cultural context in which, like, rock music coincided with religious expressions such as celebration of Orthodox Easter and other also religious Islamic religious festivals. people drank alcohol and socialized, creating these really ambiguous ethnic mixes of people who, live and act like myself. There was also alcohol and drug consumption. These are the famous anti-radiation pills called Taren, which teenagers in the village consumed as an LSD drug. And also, this Cold War also resulted in various alcohol and drug consumption patterns, and really created this very interesting and ambiguous place. As a result, the generation of people who come to the West from Tajikistan or any other country of Central Asia, when they hear that we represent this kind of post-Soviet community, they think, so you speak Russian? Are you Russian? Or are you Muslim? But for us, it's very hard to identify ourselves because we are neither Russians nor nationals. We are neither Muslim nor secular. We're kind of a little bit of everything. And if you really want to know how the Cold War ended in the post-Soviet space, is that it was the end of this ambiguity of the Soviet people. And now in Central Asia, it's like being a nation of that republic really demands being Muslim and Tajik, for example, in this case. So thank you for your attention. I'll keep it short and rather give more time to answering your questions. Thanks a lot. So I just...
Thank you so much, Faruh.
Yeah.
And in that case, let's turn our attention to our third presenter, Tibor PINTER, who's going to speak about Somalia's neighborhood policy during the Cold War.
Exactly.
Tibor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slide? Yes, and
yes.
Okay, and just a second. Okay. Okay, I think you can see the full screen mode and you can hear me. So, welcome to everyone. My name is Tibor PINTER, and first of all, I would like to thank you for being here, and I can perform my presentation about the Horn of Africa. The title is Somalia's Neighborhood Policy During the Cold War. Before I begin to show the short colonial history of this region, I have asked a question. Why Somalia is so important? It has two main geostrategic importance. On one hand, Somalia is next to the Gulf of Aden, which is a part of the busiest shipping route. It connects Europe to Asia via Suez Canal. On the other hand, Somalia has a transit position between sub-Saharan Africa and the countries of Arabia. And if we talk about the country's neighborhood policy, we can show its neighbor countries, which are Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya. From these countries, Ethiopia is the most prominent and maybe the most dangerous state for Somalia due to their mutual historical past. And my presentation is also based on the Ethiopian-Somali relationship. Before I can present the historical tie, I have to mention the idea of Greater Somalia, which always an important factor of the foreign policy of Somalia. So the extension of the real and the ethnic territory has a significant difference. On the left map, you can see the border lines and the Somalia inhabited areas, which is pink on the map in Horn of Africa. Kenya and Ethiopia also have such areas which not belong to Somalia. The pink triangular area in Ethiopia is the Ogaden region, which is the bone of the conflicts among the two states. The roots of the conflicts can be traced back to the colonial period. In the late 19th century, the colonial powers divided the Horn of Africa among themselves. The British Empire insisted on the northern part, and Italy got the central and the southern one. The northern part was important for the British because its colonial empire had the shipping routes which that connected Britain with the Indian colony. A couple of decades ago, the Suez Canal had been built, and the colonial power wanted to cover this route. Italy wanted to build a colonial empire, but the newly formed state was only able to get the eastern part of the Horn of Africa. This green color shows that the most of present-day Somalia was an Italian colonial territory. After the Ethiopian victory over Italy, a new settlement agreed between the powers in 1896-1897. Ethiopia is granted the Ogaden, and the weakened Italy had to accept it. This expansion led to the fact that relations between Somalia and Ethiopia have been quite tense to this day. During the World War II, Italy lost its territories and came under British control. This couple of years territorial unit, Euro unification, reaffirming Somalia's struggle for independence. But after the war, claiming that fascism ceased, Italy regained its territories. And under these circumstances, we get the Cold War, which brought with it a wave of decolonization. And from independence to dictatorship, on July 1st, 1960, British Somaliland and Italian Somalia unified, and the independent Somalia was established. In the first couple of years, the country supported the non-aligned movement. This is shown in the upper right map, which highlights that Somalia was a member of the non-aligned movement and, for example, attended the conference in 1961. But this situation was not endured because the original foreign policy directive was the idea of Great Somalia. The Somali leaders wanted to get back the Ogaden region from Ethiopia and the eastern part from Kenya. But these countries enjoyed the Western support, and for this reason, Somalia began to be closer to the Soviet Union. But in 1969, dramatic change happened. A domestic political crisis developed. The Somali army led by General Siad Barre staged a bloodless coup, and he served as president and military ruler of Somalia from 1969 to 1991. At the beginning of the dictatorship, more and more Soviet advisors appeared in Somalia. The political connection between these two parties manifested in a treaty of friendship in 1974. Siad Barre wanted to reorganize and modernize Somali society on the basis of a synthesis of scientific socialism and Islamic principles. Although the clan system that formed the social structure of the country was the main obstacle, which later caused the system to collapse. But as a general, his power was based on the army, which needed to be developed. The foreign support. Before the military coup, the Soviet Union gave to Somalia a $35 million loan to create and equip an army of 20,000 men. Apart from this, the Soviets made key infrastructure improvements. In the beginning of the dictatorship, the Soviet support increased drastically, delivered more modern artillery cannons, warplanes, and tanks. Middle Eastern states tried to counteract Soviet military influence. Saudi Arabia supported the Somali government with loans. Kuwait sold 40 Centurion tanks to the army. Egypt supplied torpedo boats, handguns, and parts for Soviet equipment. Somali officers received further training in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. Staff officers, intelligence, and technical officers were trained in Sudan. The result of this competition was that Somalia became the strongest military power in East Africa. At this time, the Western Bloc did not want to give military support, but a couple of years later, the situation changed. Siad Barre was expected to exploit the potential of this army. The idea of Greater Somalia floated before his eyes. The most obvious targets were Kenya and Ethiopia. So far, Somalia has funded border militias aimed at seceding from Kenya or Ethiopia and joining Somalia. Somalia was unable to achieve spectacular results in doing so, but it caused enough tension to form a military alliance between Kenya and Ethiopia. Ethiopia's regional superpower status began to decline. Its army needed modernization and further improvements were needed. In 1974, an unexpected turn occurred. In September, the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie was expelled by the Derg, which was a Marxist-Leninist junta. One of the most defining figures in the Derg was Mengistu Haile Mariam. This military coup made a period of turmoil. The Ethiopian chaos was a perfect opportunity for Siad Barre to regain the Ogaden region. As a first step, he began to fund anti-Ethiopian guerrilla movements on the border even better. Ethiopia then accused Somalia of unlawfully interfering in its internal affairs, in response to which the Somali army invaded the Ogaden region in 1977. A total of 50,000 regular and irregular Somali soldiers were in the area. Initially, the aggressors were superior in all areas. It had more modern and larger military equipment and devices. By September 1977, 90% of the region was under Somali rule, but at this time Ethiopia managed to stop the advance. The turning point was the Soviet Union. As a communist regime came to power in Ethiopia, the Soviets gained another ally, which is more important than the Somali one. A communist Ethiopia was far more important to the Soviet Union than Siad Barre's Somalia. Thus, the Soviets did not support Somalia's war efforts. Not only was Siad Barre left alone in the Ogaden War, but with significant Soviet support, the Ethiopian army soon reorganized itself. What's more, 15,000 Cuban soldiers came to the country for help. The Ethiopian-Cuban-Soviet relationship grew stronger. For example, Fidel Castro met Mengistu. Respectively, the people of the Derg also turned up in Moscow. This is shown in the two pictures below. The reorganized Ethiopian army had 50,000 in the Ogaden region, supplemented by Soviet artillery and tank support. In 1978, combat fortune was reversed. The Ethiopian counterattack began, as a result of which the Somali army had to keep back. Finally, in March 1978, Siad Barre ordered a full retreat. The substantive part of the war ended here. The Somali guerrillas returned to the guerrilla war, but by mid-1980, the Ethiopian army beat the guerrillas, and some Somali subunits remained there, still controlling parts of Ogaden. Moreover, in 1982, Ethiopia attacked Somalia with Soviet support with no tangible results, but it set in motion a process that led to the fall of Siad Barre. For Somalia, the adventure in Ogaden was catastrophic. The army lost 8,000 people, a third of its personnel, and 2/3 of the armored forces and half of the air force. And because of the Soviet-Ethiopian alliance and the perpetuating border disputes with its neighbors, Somalia was completely isolated in foreign policy. As the Eastern Bloc withdrew from Somalia, Barre began to approach the Western Bloc. The presentation stopped, and okay. Oh, I don't know what happened. This is. Sorry for the inconvenience. After the war, support for the regime declined, so Barre's goal was to retain power. Therefore, Barre and his immediate circle sought to fully monopolize political and economic life. But the war consumed costs that put severe pressure on the economy. Barre saw the key to a solution as he approached the West. The United States provided an economic recovery loan through the IMF, the cost of which was a thorough transformation of the economy. In short, the IMF obligated Barre to reduce state intervention and stimulate economic liberalization. This unleashed white capitalism, making the country vulnerable. The question arises that why Somalia became important to the United States. In 1979, two events took place in world politics, which contributed to the recooling of the two superpowers. One is the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and the other is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Because of this, the United States felt it could easily be at a geostrategic disadvantage, even in Africa. Because Ethiopia enjoyed Soviet support, America wanted to prevent the Soviet Union from extending its influence to the whole of East Africa. And Siad Barre broke the ties with the Soviet Union, forcing the United States to support the regime. Thus, keeping the system alive was the interest of the Western superpower. Rapid restructuring and defeat in the war undermined confidence in the system. The clans made an increasing voice of their dissatisfaction, which led to rebellion and armed clashes. By 1990, major changes had taken place. The Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan and then disintegrated. The United States won the Cold War. Thus, it was not important for America to maintain the Barre regime. And referring to human rights violations, the United States was betrayed from behind Barre, leaving the dictator alone on the brink of the civil war in Somalia. By 1991, Siad Barre had fled the country and Somalia had become a failed state for 20 years. And the conclusion, the colonial era border disputes culminated during the Cold War. Relations between Ethiopia and Somalia remain fragile, as Somalia has still not given up on the implementation of the Greater Somalia idea. The Horn of Africa was a playground for the superpowers during the Cold War. The Soviet Union first supported Somalia and then Ethiopia. Taking advantage of this shift, the Western Bloc emerged in an attempt to offset the growing Soviet expansion. Although there has been no superpower proxy war in the region, it is an excellent demonstration of the geostrategic game of the great powers, resembling a chess match. For almost 20 years after the fall of Barre, anarchy reigned in Somalia, perhaps the best known manifestation of which was piracy. The situation has been much more stable in recent years, but it's still not considered a stable state. And finally, I would like to thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Tibor, for this presentation on Somalia. And I think we should move on to take a look at Buyisile and NTAKA's presentation on the Soviet Union and basically the ANC's relation during 1960 and 1990, if I am correct. So
Okay.
Buyisile, the floor
Please
is yours.
let me know when you see the presentation.
I see your screen, yes.
Do you see anything yet?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
So please go ahead.
Okay, just a second, please.
No problem.
Okay, good day, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity for me to do this presentation, and it is titled The Soviet Union and Liberation Movements in Southern Africa. And I will specifically be looking at the case of the ANC in South Africa from 1960 to 1990. The structure of the presentation is as follows. I'm going to begin with an introduction and then talk about the aim of the presentation. And then I will provide a definition of liberation movements. Thereafter, I'm going to provide a very brief overview of the liberation movements in Southern Africa. Then, for the purposes of the presentation, I'm going to just give a summary of the US foreign policy towards Southern Africa. Thereafter, I'm going to turn to the Soviet foreign policy towards Africa and the strategy for Southern Africa. Then I will discuss the case study, which is the ANC, and then look at the Soviet Union's role in South Africa's liberation movement. Finally, I will briefly touch on the catastrophe of the Cold War in Southern Africa, and then I will conclude the presentation. Okay, so as we all know, the Cold War was between the Soviet Union and its allies after the Second World War versus the United States and its NATO allies. And basically, proxy wars, propaganda, space, and nuclear races, for example, were all characteristic of this conflict. Furthermore, the Cold War significantly impacted on the newly independent states in Africa and the liberation struggles from the 1960s to the 1990s. And the Cold War also acted as an ideological foundation for the white minority regimes and the liberation movements at the time. So the opponents both used the Cold War to legitimize their actions. And in pursuing their goals, Southern Africa was essentially plagued with damaging wars. And this often led to interventions by the Cold War superpowers and other countries. To further compound this situation, the South African government's policy of destabilization against its neighbors prevented economic and political development in the region. So the presentation is aimed at discussing the role of the Soviet Union in supporting the liberation movements in Southern Africa, following their strategy for the region. And I will be focusing on the African National Congress in South Africa from 1960 to 1990. In order for me to do this, I have reviewed the literature, and the scholars that have written around the topic have more or less referred to archival documents, press releases, and in some cases, interviews with persons or actors that were in the space at the time. And so the presentation will be limited to their interpretation of the sources and the data as articulated in the literature. So how do we define national liberation movements? Well, very simply, they are or were constituted a category of armed non-state actors that appeared mainly in the decolonization period, and they related to people's self-determination. Turning our attention to Southern Africa, there were 5 main liberation movements that occurred in 5 countries, and these were in Angola, in Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, formerly known as Rhodesia. And essentially, the liberation movements were an armed struggle against the then oppressive white minority regimes. And this was true for Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, and against Portuguese colonial rule in Angola and Mozambique. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I'm just going to give a summary of what the US foreign policy was towards Southern Africa. Essentially, it attempted to balance US economic, scientific, and strategic interests in the white states with the political interest of dissociating itself from the white minority regimes in the region and their repressive racial policies. Turning to the Soviet foreign policy towards Africa, the literature indicates that the Soviet Union became increasingly involved in Africa after Stalin. So Khrushchev's Moscow realized the importance of the Third World, and in Africa, they saw the opportunity to continue waging its ideological battle against the West, whilst supporting the liberation movements, increasing their presence in the continent, and gaining access to military facilities. So the main objectives was to reduce Western and Chinese influence in Africa, as I mentioned, increasing their presence and influence in the continent and in domestic and international affairs, gaining African support on international issues, having access to military facilities, obtaining needed commodities and profits from arms sales, and also to support the spread of Marxism-Leninism. So looking at the Soviet strategy for Southern Africa, essentially the Soviet Union was the main external supporter of the liberation movements in the region. It is said that initially Southern Africa was not that interesting for the Soviet Union for a number of reasons. Some of them being that, for example, Angola and Mozambique were Portuguese colonies, and of course, Portugal is a NATO country. Zimbabwe belonged to the British, and there were the vested Western interests in South Africa. So any kind of Soviet military pressure could have easily triggered a Western response, which was not exactly what the Soviet Union ideally would have wanted. And geographically, it is also said that Southern Africa was a bit difficult to reach with Soviet arms. However, the region did pique Soviet interest in the sense that it represented a revolt against the West. And as such, the Soviets became involved in Southern Africa. Mainly, they provided the arms and financial aid to the liberation movements. And also, it is said that other reasons that propelled them to be involved was because, for example, the US was preoccupied with what was happening post-Vietnam. Angola was fighting the South African government, of which many African countries didn't want them to win. And also their removal from Egypt meant that the Soviets had both the resources, time, and inclination to have a presence in Southern Africa. So turning to the case study, I'm looking at the African National Congress. It was founded in 1912. Formerly, it was the South African National Native Congress. And in 1923, it was renamed to the ANC. And its main objective was to fight for the rights of Black South Africans who at the time were living in a system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination. So following the Sharpeville massacre, which was a violent clash between protesters and the South African police that took place in the township of Sharpeville in 1960, the ANC was formally banned from political life in South Africa. And in the 70s and the 80s, the ANC came to the realization that they could no longer confront the apartheid regime with nonviolent methods and essentially began to use guerrilla tactics to confront the state. Thereafter, the ANC was seen as a terrorist organization by the state and subsequently by the West. However, they were receiving tactical support from the Soviets. And within the Soviet bloc, one of the main supporters was East Germany. The communist parties had articulated their solidarity to the ANC, and as such, the GDR was also providing training and in some instances was even housing those that were exiled who were ANC members at the time. So turning to the role of the Soviet Union in South Africa's liberation movement, firstly, I'm going to give a bit of a brief history about the Soviet-South Africa relations, which began in the 20s. The Kremlin mostly supported the Communist Party of South Africa. And in 1942, Soviet-South Africa relations were formally established. Then comes the time of the Cold War, and the relations became somewhat strained thereafter, simply because the Communist Party of South Africa had aligned itself with the ANC. And as such, the Kremlin directly or indirectly was also supporting the ANC. And of course, this didn't sit well with the government of South Africa at the time. And also the leaders of the Nationalist Party in South Africa that came into power were very anti-communist. So when they had won the elections, they delivered on one of the promises that they had made, which was to sever ties with the Soviet Union. And of course, this materialized in 1956. And as such, the Soviet policy towards South Africa in the 60s and 70s was thereafter informed by the opportunities that were presented by the emerging liberation movement. And in 1961, following the Sharpeville massacre, of course, the ANC formed its military wing, and the Soviets were the leading source of military support and training in this instance. Later on, the Soviet Union also became very vocal in the international effort to sanction South Africa economically and politically. So the Soviet Union's support of the armed struggle basically continued well into the 80s, and it seemed unwavering. But things took a bit of a turn when the then president of the ANC, Oliver Tambo, announced that the ANC was going to be attacking the enemy head on. And it had a new objective, and this new objective was to make South Africa ungovernable and make apartheid unworkable. And initially, the Soviets were on board with this resistance, and they supported it as it grew. But later, they began to question its morality and the violence against civilians, as there were many casualties of the conflict between the ANC and the South African government. So the Soviet pessimism began to grow, and also within the camp, there was a shift in thinking, and it was more towards the idea of having a negotiated settlement to solve the South African problem. But this led to a divergence of views between the ANC and Moscow, so much so that it is said that when Oliver Tambo actually visited Moscow, he was very vocal in noting that the people that are taking part in the liberation struggle, the ANC cadres, had every right to use any means and methods necessary to fight the apartheid state, and that included armed struggle. And so this kind of created a bit of a rift, but not too much, between Moscow and the ANC. However, Moscow also began to diversify its contacts within South Africa, which was against, well, it was unusual because it had a policy of only having ties to one liberation movement in a country. And they also never encouraged resistance groups to cooperate because there was always a concern that this might lead to a dilution of the ideology, which of course the ANC had a Marxist ideology at the time. But as tensions kind of grew a bit, they began to be open to other resistance groups in South Africa and to liberal whites who also wanted to kind of see a change in regime. And the thinking behind this as well was that if indeed talks began around a negotiated settlement, the interests of these groups would also be taken into consideration. However, Moscow did remain the major supplier of the ANC up until the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So just to briefly touch on the catastrophe of the Cold War in Southern Africa, the literature alludes to the fact that the politician who was mostly responsible for this was the former South African Defense Minister, P.W. Botha. Essentially, the South African government's vision of regional security went beyond just curbing the rise of African nationalism and the threats that decolonization posed to the white minority regimes. And so the government saw the threat through an East-West ideological conflict, and it envisaged itself being positioned in the camp of the West in the conflict as part of the fight against the global threat of communism. And so in the 70s, the South African government undertook a strategy of counter-revolutionary warfare to counter the Soviet threat. But of course, this essentially was to fight the ANC at the time. And this completely destabilized the region. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it meant that economically and politically, development was stifled and also led to high numbers of casualties of South Africans as well as non-South Africans in the region. So to just wrap and summarize everything up, the presentation aimed to give an idea of how the Soviet Union supported the liberation movements in Southern Africa, specifically the ANC, but this was essentially across the board, generally in the other countries as well, that I mentioned at the beginning. And even though the Soviet Union did collapse, of course, eventually, the collapse was also a contributing factor to Western governments changing their views about the ANC and putting pressure on the South African government to lift the ban on the group. And in 1990, the beginning of the end of apartheid essentially began in South Africa. And the first democratic elections were held in 1994. And so it is said that Moscow's support to the movements and the independent countries in Southern Africa in military terms was especially important because it was often provided at a time and where other countries were unable or unwilling to help. And I think we can safely conclude that if this help or support, if I can say this, had not been there, it might have taken the movements a little longer to achieve their objectives. And with that, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Buyisile. And this concludes the presentation of our panelists. So now I would like to turn to our audience. As we did it in the previous section, please raise your hands virtually, and then I will give you the opportunity to speak. So first we have already a hand by Gabas Marco, so please go ahead.
Okay, so thank you very much for the presentation. I want to ask a couple of questions to the last speaker who spoke about South Africa. So my first question is, was the ANC and other black parties supported also by other African countries, which at the time were already independent, like Algeria, for example, or were they influenced ideologically by thinkers like Fanon? And then my second question is, what is, in general, the opinion in present-day South Africa about this ANC communist Soviet link in the black and in the white community? Because, for example, when Nelson Mandela died, I remember that at the time there were a bit of polemics in the West saying, yeah, after all, he was a terrorist, he was a communist, possibly we should not support him so much and something like that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Should I respond now?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry, Marco, I didn't get your first question. Can you please repeat it for me?
Yes, my first question was the ANC and other anti-apartheid parties at the time were also supported by other African countries, which at the time were already independent, like Algeria, for example. And that's why I also asked, was the ANC or other anti-apartheid parties influenced by thinkers like Fanon, Frantz Fanon?
Okay. Yes, so you're right. The ANC was supported by other African countries at the time. For example, the one that you've mentioned, and also another one that comes up is Libya as well, because I know that Colonel Gaddafi was one of the prominent figures that was very vocal and always was in solidarity with the ANC and providing the movement as well with the resources it needed in order to undertake the agenda at hand. And I'm not 100% entirely sure about being influenced by Fanon. Did I understand you correctly? But I'm guessing, or I'm assuming that it is possible, but I can't give you a definitive answer on that one. With regards to your second question, so how do South Africans see the ANC communist relationship nowadays, reflecting on it? So I guess it will differ depending on which side you're on. I think for Black South Africans, it was obviously a plus and it was an advantage. As I said in the presentation, it came at a time when some countries were not willing to help. And it wasn't just the Soviets, it was alongside them the Cubans, and as I've mentioned, Colonel Gaddafi and Yasser Arafat. So for Black South Africans, that was, of course, helpful in order for the liberation movement to progress in its mandate, and that was to liberate those that were oppressed at the time. So I guess for Black South Africans, it's a plus, it's looked on positively, irrespective of whatever narratives there are about those particular individuals. For the most part, that is a discussion for another day, but essentially it's a plus. And I guess, look, I don't want to give any definitive answers again. I can only speculate for those that are non-Black South Africans, it might be a conflicted issue. On the one hand, if they are liberals, they might also be on the side of, well, it was a good thing and it was good that support that was there. If they're perhaps not so liberal, they might have seen it as just an interference in domestic South African political affairs. So yeah, that's about as much as I can give you on that one.
Thank you so much. I see another person would like to pose a question. So Armstrong, please go ahead.
Hi. So again on the South Africa presentation, do you think we can see the West being unwilling to help as partially a result of the communists stepping in and therefore them not like them having the ANC as someone which is aligned with the communist movement, and therefore in opposition to that they cannot help the like apartheid, the anti-apartheid movement there? Does that make sense?
So if I understood your question correctly, could that be a reason why they were unwilling to help?
Yeah,
because the ANC was part of the communist camp, if I can say that.
Effectively.
So I think on the surface level, that was probably the narrative. But that was very much, like I'm saying, on the surface level. You may or may not know that most Western countries had vested interests in South Africa economically as well. And of course, it's very probable that if you go against, or if they went or had opposed the government at the time, they may as well have compromised those interests. And so perhaps it was, in light of that, better to turn a blind eye to what was happening, but on the surface level, still be vocal that, well, they're not going to support the ANC because it's a terrorist organization, it's part of the communist camp, etc. And as I was reading as well, there's also, the literature alludes to the fact that, for example, the US, and I think the keynote speaker might have mentioned something like this as well. At the time in the US, there was also this institutionalized racial segregation issues as well. And so perhaps it is not far-fetched to see how, in light of that, a country like the US might have again turned a blind eye to what was happening in South Africa. But yes, that was, I guess, the surface level narrative of, well, we're not supporting them because they're part of the communist camp, but I think there were other underlying factors. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, you did, thanks.
Thank you so much. Do we have any further questions? Well, if not, let me just ask one question from Hasan, because I think that presentation was also very interesting. Nevertheless, all the presentations were very, very interesting. But Hasan, you mentioned a number of times that the Turkish people in the countryside were not ready for democratic change, if I phrase you correctly. So regarding that, what do you think are the conditions that make certain populations ready for Western-style democracy or democracy in any form?
Well, first of all, it's a good question. I'm not sure if I can provide a definite answer for that, but the reason why I make such a claim is that none of the reforms or the revolution has arrived at the rural areas. So you cannot, I mean, if people doesn't know how to read or write, or if people doesn't even know that they are in a Republican regime, like they think that they are still in the Ottoman period, and you know, and if you try to make such a change like a Republican regime, abolish the Sultanate, because those people had hundreds of years of they were managed under the religious rules in the Ottoman Empire. That's why I made such a claim that those people were not ready for that.